we've got people still coming in, but I think we should make a start on today's session. That's okay?
Yeah, no problem. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our final session of the day. My name is Caroline Crawford, and I'm a grants manager with Rosa Fund. Thank you so much for coming to our closing session of our conference and also our final keynote, which is chaired by Rosa's own CEO, Rebecca, who today will be looking at the women and girls sector across the UK with speakers from England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. Just a couple of things to note before we kick off. If you have any questions you'd like to ask the panel in the latter half of the session, or topics you'd like them to discuss, please do add them in the Q&A box, which is on the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're quite limited on time, so apologies in advance if the chair and the panel are not able to address all the questions. But please do use the chat box to say hello. We'd love to know who you are and where you're coming from. The session is also being recorded for public viewing at a later time. And there'll also be a 5-minute comfort break halfway through. I'll hand over to Rebecca to kick us off. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Caroline. I really appreciate that. And welcome everybody to today's session. I feel really, really fortunate that Rosa has been able to be joined today by such a great range of speakers from, as Caroline said, across the United Kingdom. And it's always so important to us as an organisation and as a funder that we are able to reach women's and girls' organisations across the country, because we know that collectively women and girls face the same issues, the same discrimination, the same inequality and the same challenges, but equally bringing together organisations from across the country allows us to see how shared our experiences are and how specific some experiences are to each nation. And that's what I'm really looking forward to hearing from today. We have on the panel Vivienne Hayes, who's the Chief Executive of the Women's Resource Centre, Girijamba Polubothu, who today is representing Scottish Women's Convention and Shakti Women's Aid. We've got Karen Sweeney from the Women's Support Network Northern Ireland. We've got Catherine Fookes from WEN Wales, and we've got Baljit Banga from the Chief Executive of Imkaan. So it's a great lineup, and we're going to hear from each of the panelists, and then there'll be an opportunity, as Caroline said, for you to ask questions. Catherine Fookes has got to leave at about 1:50, so she will be gone at that point. And so I'm going to ask Viv Hayes to kick us off with her thoughts today. And yes, take the floor, Viv.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to you and Rosa for having me. So much to say, so I've decided to focus on themes that I think affect all the 4 nations. So our questions are, what are the opportunities and challenges? And I'm going to start with the challenges, which are numerous, as I'm sure I don't need to tell you all. And a lot of them relate to the under-resourcing of our sector, and in some cases, what I'd call the dismantling of our sector. But I really want to talk about some of the things that might be leading to that. I think the first thing that I pick up everywhere I go and everyone I speak to is a complete lack of valuing the work that our sector does. We know that the work women's organisations do is life-changing and on many occasions life-saving. And I just want to say, when I talk about the women's sector, what I'm talking about led by and for organisations. And in case some of you don't know what that means, although I suspect you will, we're talking about organisations that are led by the women with whom they work. So if you're talking about Turkish-speaking women, then we're talking about Turkish women's organisations who speak Turkish. So I just want to clarify that because I think it's fundamental. I think our work is massively undervalued, ignored. Some of us are silenced or not listened to. And I think we have been moving towards gender neutralising, if you like, the work of the women's sector. And along with the commissioning, competitive commissioning, we now see work traditionally carried out and indeed started by women's organisations being delivered by generic organisations such as housing associations or generic voluntary sector orgs or even private sector orgs. And with that, we also see the traditional work of led by and for Black women's organisations being an attempt to deliver that by white women's organisations. And I think all that's highly problematic. The women's sector grew out of the women's liberation movement, which over decades had developed a structural analysis of women's sex-based oppression. And within that, thanks to numerous Black feminists and their work, a structural analysis of racism. Those things are absolutely critically important to the way that we run our organisations and the way that we work with women. Back in the day, it was an us, not an us and them. And so the workers were not somehow separated or put on a pedestal compared to the service users. We work together as a group. That has got lost in some organisations where this idea of professionalisation of the sector has taken hold. And I challenge that notion because the most professional way of working is simply to meet the needs of the women. That's what professional is. So this kind of move to undervalue us, to act like anybody can do our work is problematic. It's leading to the disinvestment in the sector. But also there are internal challenges that we face as a sector. And it's very difficult for us to change the external environment. I would say that we've actually lost ground in the last 10 years in a number of ways. And so we need to do something different to create social change. But in order to achieve that, we need to reflect upon what we're doing and how we're doing it and how we are in places becoming depoliticized as a movement. Because the women's sector is not only about delivering the life-saving services that I mentioned, it's actually about achieving social change for women based upon a human rights approach. And I have seen many changes over the last 10 to 15 years, which I don't think are good changes. I say, you know, what is our response to competitive tendering? What are we doing about it? How do we address that? Do we just join in and compete with each other? Or in the tradition of feminist work, do we try to create new ways of doing things? That has always been a critical ingredient of the women's sector, is the creativity to go forward in uncharted territories, because we don't have a system anywhere that we can say that's about women's human rights. If you look globally, women are oppressed globally. And so I think we've got to get braver in the way that we address the system that we work within that seeks to divide us and to diminish us. One thing I really think is critical in that is solidarity. Imagine women are over half the population of this country, yet still our rights are getting rolled backwards. Why? I've just looked today at a new funding announced, and they mentioned all the protected characteristics under the Equality Act, but they failed to mention sex and they failed to mention women. So it seems to me that we're not actually being named as an oppressed group anymore. And that might be because we're not a minority. I don't know, but it's problematic. So I think we need to look at the internal work. That for me is the opportunity, is the internal work that we can do to build our solidarity. And I think with the recent events and the Black Lives Matter movement, we now have an opportunity to do that anti-racist work that seems to have been left to one side. I really, really believe that if we can build our collective voice in support of all women, not just the women who look like ourselves, but the most marginalized women, I think we have a much stronger chance of overturning and making gains for our sector. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Viv. I think that is such a brilliant and useful analysis of where we are at the moment in the UK. And I think you're right also to highlight the fact that there was a point when it was different and it felt different, and that kind of rolling back is very, very hard for a lot of organisations. So I'm now going to ask Karen Sweeney from Women's Support Network Northern Ireland to speak. So Karen, can you talk to us about what you think the opportunities and challenges ahead are for women's organisations in the women and girls sector?
I'm coming to you from a very rainy Belfast here, just to let you know. So good afternoon, everyone. I thought when I looked at the question, I thought, well, to give you an idea of the sector, I thought I might explain it a little bit here on ourselves. So we would consider to have within the sector quite a strong, vibrant sector. In terms of ourselves, the Women's Support Network, we were set up by a number of women's centres here in the Greater Belfast area in 1989. And that was to provide capacity building and enable them and to advocate for them to deliver frontline services for women. We're very lucky in that we have 14 established women's centres across Northern Ireland. And these are centres that provide support, childcare, education, training, the counselling for women. But again, what has been touched on there and what I'd say in terms, our first women's centres grew out of what would have been the conflict, the troubles here in Northern Ireland, where women were coming together in the 70s to support each other because of what was happening. And out of that grew our first two women's centres in the early 1980s, in 82, in fact, one on each of the main traditions here. But how they have grown and developed over the years into centres, as I say, providing essential frontline services for women. And women now from all traditions, not just the two main traditions. I'll give you an example. Falls Women's Centre here before COVID had to celebrate International Women's Day. And they had, where they got all the women to bring different food from all their traditional cultures. And there was over 23 different languages and cultures represented at that one Women's Day event. So you can see that we are growing and expanding and new and emerging cultures within Northern Ireland. WSN is the Women's Support Network. As I say, we support women's centres, organisations and groups. We're also a member of the Women's Regional Consortium. Now, this is a group of 7 regional organisations that advocate on behalf of the sector. And we came together because we were working kind of, if you like, independently. We all had our membership, but we've combined that membership and we would have over 550 groups on that's centres, groups and organisations on that membership, where we would supply then, that they're not getting bombarded with different emails. So we would ensure that they get funding advice and information on what's happening. But we also advocate then, and we also act as a conduit between making sure that we get women's voices heard on the ground to inform policy development, and we carry out research to inform government departments, statutory organisations and elected representatives on the key issues impacting women in disadvantaged and rural areas. So now it's been difficult over the last year, as everybody I'm sure has realised, and I just, but in terms of, even though it's over Zoom or telephone or some face-to-face, we've responded to over 24 different consultations and been invited even over the UK to the Works and Pensions to give evidence from some of our research on universal credit, the 5-week wait. We've been addressing the Domestic Abuse and Family Proceedings Bill here in Northern Ireland, zero contract hours, and a Bill of Rights. But in addition to that, within WSN, with the assistance of Rosa and the Justice and Equality Fund, we were set up the First Rate Prices Service just before COVID hit. There hadn't been any service here for 16 years. And it's a service that provides information and emotional support to those impacted by rape and sexual assault. So I hope I don't go on too long, but what about the challenges? And I think this is what has been mentioned. I would love to say there's very little challenges, but I think we know that the challenges that have been around for, when you look at the suffragettes, they're 100 years from the Women's Sunday, and we look at the things and the inequalities that still exist and have been exacerbated by COVID, and highlighted just the work. Talking about the women's centres during COVID, I think sometimes, as you say, I had said the same things that was just mentioned there: underfunded, undervalued, and not represented, or sometimes not seen of the work that they do in their communities. Our women's centres and some groups kept going all through the pandemic. When other childcare facilities closed, they kept their childcare open and took in children that maybe never had before, children of key workers and vulnerable children who needed sponsored daycare. But, there's also, we need to look at that. One of the challenges that we would see is that we need to look at the value of that work that's done in communities by these organisations. There's a challenge to do a piece of work to look at the real social return on investment and to see and make sure that it is valued. We've been hit by funding cuts year on year from 2008. And as you said, it was said there, it's where the need for the work is growing, the value and the funding is diminishing. We also have that problem with larger voluntary organisations and training organisations come into Northern Ireland and win tenders to deliver training or different programmes. And then they come to us in the sector to put bums on their seats without thinking about the barriers that are needed, such as childcare and the timing of when courses take place, travel to these courses. So, it's done without thinking, and we need to look at how that's happening. Other things that we need to, in terms of challenging, is looking overall, and I looked at it in terms of the gender inequalities that still exist today. The challenge is that we need to be equal in all walks of society. We need affordable, accessible childcare. We want to be valued as women, and we want our voice out. We want to be paid a fair wage. We want to feel safe everywhere we go. Should we call it home, work, and society, free from sexual harassment, domestic sexual violence, coercion. These are things that we've been fighting so many years for and still need to fight. And that is a challenge. We need to see here in Northern Ireland the CEDAW recommendations, for the full, they recommend the full implementation of abortion services in Northern Ireland, which our government is still, different parts of the government is still fighting. Even today, this morning, I was watching from the health committee where they were given evidence. They're trying to stop it at every angle. So what are our opportunities then? I looked at, well, we do have at the moment, I think one of the great opportunities, and it's funny that COVID has brought this about, but greater collaboration. Now, there's a lot of work to be done regionally, locally and regionally, but I think even across the regions of the UK, we can now work in better collectively. And maybe Zoom has opened that up and we can see more and get more people involved. But I think, especially here in Northern Ireland, and I'm sure it's mirrored across all the regions, we need to look at, the hardship that women are experiencing. We need to look, that welfare reform needs addressed, discrimination, harassment, domestic sexual violence, I've said. So we have today, actually in the executive, we're getting the Justice Bill signed off finally. Now, the Justice Bill will bring in some measures and legal protections that we've been campaigning for a long time in terms of creating a more efficient and effective justice system. There'll be provisions, a number of priorities arising out of the Gillen review. Now, the Gillen review was undertaken.
You've got about 1 minute.
Okay. I'll just say, so we've got the Justice Bill coming in. We have a suite of we've gotten the gender equality strategy is being developed, anti-poverty strategy, childcare strategy, all which we've been without. And we think, you know, one of the challenges now is to hold government to account on the actions that they bring forward within these strategies. And we also then, there's been full sign up by the Northern Ireland Executive to bring forward the violence against women and girls strategy. Now, that was in the wake of Sarah Everett's murder, but it did create momentum here in terms of the executive. But unfortunately, since then, it hasn't been seen. It's been hidden under a pile somewhere. But I think we have lots of challenges. We still have to keep working, but work collectively. And that's what I would like to see happen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. And I think you bring such an important perspective to this in terms of the work you do, not only with the having to, you know, respond to consultations from the UK government, but also from the Northern Ireland government as well. And so that kind of involvement in that level of political consultation, and also working so closely with women on the ground as well. And Rosa's delighted to have been able to fund the rape crisis service that you've set up, and horrified that Northern Ireland's been so poorly served by such a service for such a long time. I'm now going to turn to Girijamba. Girijamba is representing both Scottish Women's Convention and Shakti Women's Aid, but she's still only got the same amount of time as everyone else.
I think it's better to be the last one, then I can say echo everything everybody's saying. And actually, I do echo what Vivienne has said. Most of the things that I wanted to say, she already has said in relation to the sector, women's sector, specifically for BME sector. And for myself, I find we are actually going backwards rather than forwards when it comes to BME sector. Anyway, first I'll talk about Scottish Women's Convention. We continue to work right through the pandemic to ensure women's voices are not lost. In the past 12 months, SWC held conferences on social care, mental health, COVID-19, to name a few, really, and these have really highlighted the inequalities women were facing. This helped SWC to take their voices and raise them at the highest level of government and influence some of the policies and legislation which was put in place at the time. They're also involved in cross-party groups, but the opportunities that SWC has is to reach out to more women who may have been unable to physically attend some of their conferences due to either distance, accessibility, location. This meant that most women were not able to take part in their consultations, but now with the online digital, that's one of the opportunities that they're finding, that, you know, they'll be able to reach out to the hard to reach women. And they also, and another thing I think with online platform is that they could include like captioning, BSL interpreters, language interpreters at their events to help gain voices of women who may not have been heard. So it's much easier on online rather than face-to-face. And also what I have observed is that whenever SWC does do consultations, there's very low or no representation of intersectionality or women from BME communities, disabled, or you don't hear their voices. Hopefully this is one of the opportunity, maybe with online, moving on to online and doing more of Zooms and all, we will reach to more people than before. And challenges is that not being able to meet women physically, which meant women experiencing coercive control or domestic abuse, are living with the perpetrators and who don't have the freedom to talk freely or to express their views, or they don't take part in the events at all. So you're then missing out on their views. Other challenges faced for SWC is funding. So they're funded by the Scottish government and they do not have any policy position in most areas. This stops them from accessing funding from other funders because of the criteria set by these funders. Coming back to Shakti Women's Aid, I would like to talk about women's aid sector, and especially BME in Scotland. The BME population in Scotland is much, much lower than England. And as a result of that, even the agencies that are the BME organizations that are there are very low in number. So there is that, and like out of 36 women's aids, I think I'm right in 36, there are only 2 women's aid for BME in Scotland. And that has been for the past 35 years since Shakti was set up. 35 years, and there is no movement in that area. At the same time, one of the challenges that we BME organization, Women's Aid, I'm sorry, I'm talking more about BME rather than women's organizations as such, is that—
Don't apologize.
And that's because we always, I've been talking about the same things 20 years ago, and I'm still talking about the same things at the table, and finding we're going backwards rather than forward. One of the, two big major challenges are to do with domestic abuse and the definition of domestic abuse when it comes to perpetrators. So the domestic abuse definition is, when it comes to perpetrators, it's ex-partners or partners, whereas with honor-based violence, in our BME cases, it's also the other family members. So that needs to be acknowledged across UK if you're supporting women fleeing HPV. Then only you will provide services that are appropriate for their needs. That's one big challenge. And also supporting women with no recourse to public funds is a big challenge for us and for everybody. And fortunately, during COVID, I think the issue of no recourse to public funds has come into a bit more limelight than before because there was funding. And I hope the government will continue to fund people with no recourse to public funds. So we are hoping that's an opportunity that we have, that our government can do. What else? Because and the challenges is another thing. The universal credit is another big issue as well for Scotland. When women leaving abusive relationships, they have to wait until 6 to 8 weeks before they get the fund, they get the benefits. And most women don't have bank accounts that we support, at least don't have bank accounts or don't have any financial income coming in, or they don't have any savings, nothing. So that's a challenge for us.
You've got about just under 1 minute left, Girijamba.
So opportunities is as more collaboration work, and the challenges like what I mentioned, and unless we all work together and support each other, I don't think we're going to do justice for women. There's one main thing I wanted to say, and also everybody to acknowledge when you talk about feminism or anything, please also consider the feminism for each one of us means different, especially when you're coming from BME. For us, feminism is something different. I think some of the Western countries and the Western women have moved forward, leaving us behind, although we were with them at the table. But now we are not, we might be at the table, but when it comes to rights and we are left behind. So yeah, we shouldn't be there at the table to talk about our problems. Anybody should be able to talk about our problems. That's how it should be, not that we need to be there.
Thank you so much, Girijamba. That's such a great insight into the work that you're doing, and such a call to action for us all to ensure that all women's voices are heard, that they're around the table, and that their lives are different as a result of that. And that's what feminism must also include. Such an important insights. I'm going to move on now to Catherine Fookes from When Wales.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. Rural Wales's internet connections aren't always brilliant, but I'm going to be talking a bit about how different it is in Wales working as a women's sector organisation, and it is different, and I think we've got reasons to be optimistic here. But I do agree wholeheartedly with much of what Girijamba and the others have said. So I'm going to talk about three things. Really short introduction to Women's Equality Network Wales, so you know what we do. Secondly, I'm going to look at those challenges that we face. And then thirdly, I'm going to end on an optimistic note and talk about the opportunities. So in terms of WEM Wales, what do we do? Well, our vision is a Wales free from gender discrimination. And we're a network of organisations, individuals, organisations from the National Federation of Women's Institutes to the Wales TUC, and then lots and lots of individuals as well. And so we reach about 35,000 people through our network. And to get our vision of a Wales free from gender discrimination, we connect, we campaign and we champion to make sure that men and women have equal power and equal voice and an equal opportunity to shape both society and their own lives. And that's what we're all about. So we're about making Wales free from gender discrimination. It's a huge challenge and we can't do it all on our own. So we focus on three key strategic priorities at WEN Wales. Firstly, building the coalition. So making sure we reach more people. We're really keen to reach the new generation of activists and young women and men and get them involved in the fight for equality. So that's our first priority. Our second priority is around representation. We want diverse and equal leadership at the Senedd, in local government and across Wales in all our public boards and on NHS boards and so on. We want a diversity of representation, and that is a real problem in Wales, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. The third strategic priority of WEN Wales is to strengthen and embed women's rights. And that involves our work around CEDAW, the UN Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and really trying to protect our rights post-Brexit. So those are our three priorities. And really, I want to talk a bit about the challenges here in Wales. I've touched on one of them already. I think it's around the potential loss of rights for women post-Brexit, and how if new rights are given to women in the EU, where a lot of our rights have come from, how is that going to impact us here in Wales? Secondly, funding, absolutely agree with everything said. Long-term funding is really difficult, though we are very lucky to be funded by Welsh Government. And Girijamba, it sounds like you as well, you get funding from Scottish Government. But, we realise that we're in a really lucky position compared to those in England whose organisations like WEN Wales are no longer funded by government. The third big challenge, of course, is COVID-19 and how that has exacerbated inequalities, particularly for disabled women and women of colour. In Wales, around, I can't remember the figure 100%, but the ONS stated that around 60%, if not 65% of all deaths from COVID in Wales were disabled people. And obviously a huge proportion of those were women. And that is a huge, huge figure. And it really needs further investigation and work and a strong response. But the final area that I want to talk about in terms of challenges for the women's sector in Wales is the lack of representation for women of colour at the Senedd. We have had 20 years of devolution. We have only just had the first woman of colour elected to the Senedd in Wales, and that is absolutely appalling, and it's shame on us as women's organisations, it's shame on the citizens of Wales, and it's shame on the political parties and the government for allowing this to happen. And we're pushing very strongly for diversity and gender quotas in Wales because we've got some electoral reform coming up. So, okay, it's a challenge, and we're at WEN Wales, we're all about solutions. What can we do to really tackle those challenges? and turn them into opportunities. So first of all, in terms of the situation with the lack of diversity of disabled women, and particularly women of colour at the Senedd, we're campaigning with a coalition. We've built up a coalition of organisations under a banner called Diverse 50/50 campaign. We're working with Race Council Cymru, East, which is another BAME organisation, and ERS Cymru, and we're trying to convince parties to put in place legally binding diversity and gender quotas. And that's going to be really interesting because we need to increase the size of the Senedd. That's likely to happen. So what we're really keen on is let's not go from 60 to 90 Senedd members and they all be white middle-aged men. Let's make them diverse people. So that's a really important opportunity in the next year. The other thing that I would say that's an opportunity is we're collaborating a lot more. And I don't know if that's just because of COVID-19, but I've been on various panels with the Four Nations. We're engaged in some Four Nations work, some polling work with Engender in Scotland, with the Fawcett Society in England. And I wonder if that would have happened if it wasn't a pandemic and we could do all the meetings online. And we've really engaged. So I feel like we as women's organisations are really using this kind of the dreadful circumstances that we find ourselves in have at least let us move online and do more. I can see my time is up, so I'm going to just
got 30 seconds.
Okay. The other thing that I think by doing this further work together as Four Nations, I feel a greater understanding is developing of what it means to be devolved and how we in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales must be equal partners with England, not you know, kind of down the list because we're the devolved nations. And I feel like that's really starting to happen now, and we're cutting through more and working together more. So I'd like to finish on an optimistic note. In Wales, we have a government that's incredibly collaborative with us, and that has led, it's not all brilliant, it's not all rosy, but it has led to some incredible breakthroughs, like the first Violence Against Women Act. We had the first Children's Commissioner here, the Future Generations Act. These things are trying to embed equality. So I feel like we have a model here that can work better, and I do hope the other nations kind of look at that and can take some benefits from that as well.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Catherine. I really appreciate that. And it's always heartening to hear when institutions are able to recognise the value of women's organisations and the work that women do individually and collectively. And so it's great to hear that you're having some breakthroughs there. And I'd now want to invite Baljit Banga, the Chief Executive of Imkaan, to speak.
Thank you, Rebecca, and the Rosa Fund for the invitation to speak at your summer conference. I just want to start by quickly covering some of the policy challenges that we are facing as a sector. And I'm just going to, because there's only 5 minutes, I'm just going to look at the headlines, so I'm not going to go into detail in any of the challenges. But the main focus of the discussion that I'm going to have is really about the funding challenges facing Black and minoritized women and girls sector. And then I'll end my discussion by focusing on some of the opportunities that we see available to us. I will also just want to say that I will also be speaking from an intersectional Black feminist and social justice and anti-racism perspective, because this is a conversation that we need to have in this sector if we are going to address structural inequalities. I also want to acknowledge something that Girijamba said about us going backwards and how many decades we as Black and minoritized women have been talking about these issues, and the fact that we continue to wait for a response, not only from the government, but also from funders. And I must also say the violence against women and girls sector where we are located, where we do our work. So it is time for this sector to endorse the anti-racism charter that was developed last year, so that we can have the profound change that we seek. So first, the areas in the current policy where we have significant concerns. I'm going to look at first the Policing and Crime Bill. We have concerns about a number of measures, but mainly the increased policing and surveillance of Black and minoritized communities, the lack of critique on stop and search, and the disproportionate and heavy-handed application of this policy, the attack on democratic rights, including the right to protest, and the ongoing treatment that Black and minoritized women have received when they report to the police, as there is a long history of discriminatory police practice against communities. The second one is the prevent agenda. We have three concerns. One is the linking of prevent to violence against women and girls, which pushes a particular agenda, which means that racism and disproportionality are exacerbated, not alleviated. The second one is linking prevent to safeguarding, where we already see Black and minoritized children overrepresented in the looked after children system and the care system generally, and high levels of disparities and disproportionalities in the treatment of Black and minoritized children. And then the third concern with the prevent agenda is the agenda itself, which is highly problematic as it targets particular communities in an unequal and discriminatory way. So the third policy area that we're concerned with is actually the domestic abuse bill. It is full of omissions, and so I can't go into all of the omissions, but if you visit the Imkaan website, we've got the alternative bill, which is our response to, the Domestic Abuse Act, I should say. But what I will say here is that it does not address the rights and protections of 60% of women in the UK. It is gender neutral when it should be addressing structural inequalities. The fourth one, and Viv, you mentioned this in your opening discussion, is the whole of the public procurement regime. So the public procurement green paper, which was launched in December of 2020. This continues to include women's specialist services in public procurement. We are calling for the complete removal of women's specialist services from this regime, which is dismantling, as Viv said, which is dismantling our sector, and Black and minoritized women and girls organizations are disproportionately impacted. What we are calling for instead is ring-fenced grant funding for women's specialist services, and Viv defined that in her discussion. There are many other policy challenges, but I will now move to looking at some of the funding challenges that face our sector. The current funding crisis impacting Black and minoritized women does not result from these organizations not having the capacity to do fundraising. We have got the capacity. It doesn't result from us not being able to compete. If we have to compete, we can compete. It doesn't result from the ability to present good quality bids. We present good quality bids. The evidence suggests that most applications by Black and minoritized women's organizations actually pass the assessment stage of the funding processes, and that it is at the decision-making stage when the application arrives at the board or the executive level that the application is rejected. Evidence also shows that it is at the board and executive level where decision makers do not reflect, look like, or share the lived experiences and material realities of the people, of the women more crucially, impacted by the project proposals submitted to them for their consideration. They have no lived experiences to assess these applications. So one final piece of evidence, applications by generic white-led organizations proposing to support Black and minoritized women have a greater degree of success than applications that come from Black and minoritized women's organizations themselves. In research by Imkaan called Survival to Sustainability, we found that 25 Black and minoritized women's organizations shared a combined income of £10 million, which is the equivalent of about 400,000 per organization, while 10 generic white-led organizations shared a combined income of £25 million, which is the equivalent of 2.5 million per organization. The problem that we are talking about here is structural. This is structural inequality. It is about the way funding regimes have recreated and operate on the basis of the wider inequalities that exist in our society, so that these funding regimes actually mirror the inequalities and gatekeep how resources are allocated, which communities benefit and which communities do not. Basically, they control the process and are responsible for the exclusions as well. So if you're excluded from funding, it is because of the way the criteria is established by the funding. And I think there was an example that was given earlier. To level the playing field, to assess the chronic underfunding of the sector, we need to address structural inequalities in funding structures. So just to provide some data so it contextualizes this for you, and I will be quick. Pre-existing funding shortfall for the Black and minoritized women and girls sector at the start of COVID last year was 39% in England, Scotland and Wales. The refuge bed space shortfall is over 1,000 bed spaces. 75% of Black and minoritized women who needed to access a women's emergency refuge were not able to get safe bed spaces. The full-time staffing shortfall for the Black and minoritized sector is about 471 staff. That's 60% less than the rest of the sector. And 50% of Black and minoritized organizations had 10 or fewer staff compared to generic organizations. During the 2020 spending review, government allocated 125 million to address violence against women and girls, and in the spring budget 2021, a further 19 million was allocated to the sector. However, the overall funding shortfall is about 292 million, including 173 million for women's refuges. And I must also say that Black and minoritized women and girls organizations are disproportionately represented in underfunding data. So we are disproportionately underfunded. Opportunities to do things differently do exist. Violence against women and girls should be viewed as social justice work. We are not a commercially driven enterprise. We are not a corporate sector. Women who use our services are not customers. They are seeking redress to the violence to which they are subjected. Black and minoritized women's sector delivers services under social justice framing of the work, and this is very important. And we also save on the public purse through the reduction of repeat and secondary victimization for women and girls. We seek sustainable grant funding to do social justice work, and this is how we must be framed. The emergency fund and I'm almost finished. The emergency fund has been great during the COVID period, and it helped a lot of organizations through difficult times. But at the start of the COVID period in March 2020, as I said, the funding shortfall for organizations was 39%. So the emergency funding addressed the emergency need, but there was and it also started to address the cumulative effect of the COVID crisis. But the funding crisis is very deeply rooted, and it is historical. To address this, we need a shift in the dialogue to sustainability for the sector. We need to bring an end to short-termism. We need funders to recognize the value and the right to existence of Black and minoritized women and girls organizations. Rather than 3-year funding, think about something like 5 or 10-year funding commitments. And it does make sense because, for example, this could be done in the form of a renewal grant where an organization doesn't have to go through the application process again. Violence against women and girls requires wraparound, holistic, woman-centered, needs-led, rights-based, intersectional approaches, and this requires a funding commitment. We need funders to stop thinking about, well, what's so innovating about the work that we do? The whole of the work is innovating because we're addressing violence against women and girls. We are addressing patriarchy and inequality in our society. That's innovative. And so we need to shift this dialogue because you know what, at the end of the day, we are talking about women's lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much there, Baljit, and you have given us such a lot to think about and so much useful evidence and data. But I think that overarching theme of the structural inequality, of the need for us to shift the dialogue and shift the dial on the not just the experiences for women and girls organisations, but also for the way in which we value the work that those organisations do, and particularly the ones led by and for Black and minoritised women. I'm going to, we've had a few questions come in on the Q&A. What I'm going to suggest is we say goodbye to Catherine Fookes. Thank you so much for your contribution. I know that
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And you put some points in the chat, and if we get any, you've put your email address and so on, so do contact Catherine directly if you need to. And I'm going to suggest that we are going to take a 3-minute comfort break, come back at 5:02, and then we can give you a bit of time to think about questions. So if everyone turns their cameras off, and then we'll be back at 5:02, if that's okay. Okay, so turn my video back on. Hi there, welcome back to the session. We've got some questions in, but do keep asking them today in the Q&A session. I'm going to start with a question we've had in. It's from an anonymous attendee, and they've asked whether we can clarify what we mean by gender neutralising the women's sector. I think this is a term that you used first, Viv, today, but I think others might have something to say as well. So I'm going to start with you, and then invite the rest of the panellists to respond to what we mean by gender neutralising the women's sector.
I think basically policy making has taken a gender neutral approach. Also, we know that many of our members have been forced to provide services to men as well as women for a number of years now. And of course, as mentioned by Baljit, the inability of the government to name violence against women and girls in the domestic abuse bill. That's my answer. Thank you.
Great answer, thank you. Baljit.
Yeah, so the definition of gender neutrality is a set of policies and regulations that govern the way funding is provided to deliver violence against women and girls services, not just funding, but also policy considerations. And it is a requirement placed on access to funding that impacts the way that services must be delivered. So for example, the funding criteria could state things like that services must be delivered to both men and women without recognizing the disproportionate impact that violence against women has on women. So basically what Viv said is that it doesn't recognize that violence against women is disproportionately impacts women and girls. And so when you see things through a gender neutral lens, you actually dismiss the root causes of violence against women and girls. So gender neutrality policies and practices will hide and diminish root causes of gender inequality and violence by placing women-only services under threat. So the end result of gender neutrality is the dismantling of the women's sector. So I think
brilliant.
that's what I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Baljit. Girijamba. Oh, you're on mute.
I always do this. Baljit has explained it very well. And I think one of the risks of this is that there were, I think last year before, asking women, say, to also support men. So, yeah. So,
yeah. And Karen, would you have something to add on the gender neutrality?
Yes, don't get me started on it. The same thing is happening here exactly. We had a piece of legislation brought in 1998 with the Good Friday Agreement, which was we call Section 75, of which there's 9 groupings, and gender is one. There has been age, race, disability, etc. Now it's the implementation of that piece of legislation, which is Saturday, and the way it has been implemented is to look at if everything in terms of services of men and women are equal, then we will have equality, which isn't. And in the development of the new strategies, social strategies that we're bringing forward, we are continually arguing, for example, the anti-poverty draft strategy, the expert panel's report and recommendations. The word women is never mentioned, and yet we all know that research has proven that poverty has a gendered nature as well. And very briefly, you mentioned it, Baljit, that the same thing happened here, whereas Women's Aid got originally here, charitable funding to set up the helpline. And then when it was taken over and core funded through government and went out to tender the year before last and was won by an organisation because they were providing services for not just women and carers, but for men as well. So, yeah, and it hasn't been a good outcome. So, yeah, we're up against all the same things here and continually fighting that. There's all policies are the government is implementing, and this whole gender neutrality. So, and it will undermine the women's sector. Yeah.
That's great, thank you. I've had a question here from Rosie Lewis, and she says that as we continue to be subjected to the racialised state-endorsed decimation of women's rights, how can we better exact international obligations such as CEDAW and the Istanbul Convention to build our movement and resistance through an intersectional lens as a sector? Baljit, do you want to start with that one? Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Yeah, I'm just pulling up a few notes. Yeah, so there is a really good opportunity to incorporate CEDAW into our domestic policy. And I am just pulling up my notes. So if you give me...
well, someone else can...
yeah.
You're okay. Viv, would you want to...
Yeah.
Sure, thanks. Yeah. So WRC has led on producing the CEDAW Shadow Report for England for over a decade. And we've also worked with When Wales, NIWEP and Engender to present a Four Nations report. I call CEDAW the best kept secret in the country, because although the government has a duty to raise awareness of it, they do almost nothing to do so. And unless you're in our work, you probably have never heard of CEDAW. And CEDAW is the Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It's a UN convention. For short, we call it the UN Bill of Rights for Women. And it is critical, and with potential loss through Brexit of other human rights laws and conventions, now more than ever, we need to get behind it. We've been asking for years and years and years for the incorporation of CEDAW into domestic law, which the government have continually pushed back against, saying, oh, would be giving women extra rights. Don't make me laugh, please. The thing is with CEDAW, it's only as strong as the ability of women's human rights defenders to lobby the government on. And again, we go back to a lack of resourcing. I think Rosa's question was also about how to make sure that minoritized women's voices are heard in CEDAW. This has been a continuous challenge, because a lot of the women who've been engaged in CEDAW hitherto have been white middle class women, because if you want to go to Geneva or New York to attend the committee, mostly you've got to pay for yourself. So the women who get there are the ones with money, who are generally white middle class women. With the support actually of Rosie, who asked the question, WRC has held a CEDAW working group which was targeted at Black and minoritized women's organisation to try and redress that balance and to make sure their voices and concerns were central in the report. I think there's so much more to be done, and I think we need to really push on CEDAW, because it can make changes in government policy. But again, it's about us doing the work around the recommendations that are made from the committee. Thank you.
Baljit, do you want to come in now?
Yeah, just very quickly, that following on from what Viv said, I would also highlight the concluding observation report, because that looks specifically at the gaps in the current Domestic Abuse Act, and it also looks at underrepresentation as well as funding concerns that we've already highlighted on the discussion today. So that's the only other thing that I would highlight in addition to what Viv has already said.
Right, yeah. Karen, did you have anything to add from a Northern Ireland perspective around the obligations of CEDAW and the Istanbul Convention? You're on mute.
Sorry. I would just echo the same that has been said, and as Vivienne mentioned, the full implementation, and we've asked for that it's implemented within the development of the gender equality strategy, and especially the recommendations that have been made with respect to Northern Ireland, including, as I previously mentioned, the implementation of abortion service and rights for women's health, reproductive rights in Northern Ireland. So yeah, I echo what everybody else says. Thank you. Yeah.
Great. And Girijamba, would you like to add anything?
Same here, I echo what everybody else is saying. And also one more point I want to say is to get involved in like CEDAW or any other major policy developers. We don't have the resources at the grassroots. That's the thing. We don't even have time to read the reports. So we need an organization, minoritized or agencies need a lead organization such as Imkaan or somebody who will take our views forward, because each one of us at the frontline services, we don't have the time even to do the everyday day-to-day tasks, let alone you have the ideas to do, but you don't have time to do. So you need an umbrella body, but again, led by and for, not any umbrella body. The organization who leads BME organization should be, again, led by and for. That's one recommendation or suggestion I would like to make.
That's great. Thank you, Girijamba. I've got a couple of questions that have come in about the role of funders, which I'd be really appreciated to have your views on. One of them from Rizwana, and she asks that one of the biggest challenges is around recruiting experienced staff to run services, and then when the jobs are very dependent on funding. So what are the opportunities and obviously what are the challenges for women and girls organisations that are trying to address that issue? And I'm going to start with you, Karen, to see if you might be able to answer that one. Is it a problem that you face?
It is a big problem. It's a big problem. And part of the problem is that for many years now, we're just year-on-year funding, even some of the core funding that we get. So therefore, and decisions are left until budgets are signed off. And, you know, these are coming while there's not, while it's year-on-year budgets decided by Westminster, and then devolved down, and then decisions and signing off of budgets are not made till late. We have women who were sitting here on the 27th, 28th of March this year, not knowing whether they had a job come the 1st of April. Yeah. And that is happening every year. In addition to that, so that, you know, people are leaving where they can get more security and job security, where they have longer term contracts. So you're getting year contracts, 12-month contracts. We're losing good people. We're losing experienced childcare staff. We also have the problem that it's childcare is still one of the lowest paid in the community sector, you know, because the funding is so, we haven't had an uplift or any increase in any of our core funding since 2012. We haven't even had, you know, a cost of living increase in our funding. So in effect, we've had a 25% cut to the sector. So yes, we're facing that all the time. And it's, you know, if we can't plan and do 3-year funding plans and plan ahead, it's very debilitating and insecure. Yeah. Sorry, I'd need to find the second half. That was no,
that's essentially the question about how you recruit jobs and, you know, recruit expert staff for jobs when you're so dependent on funding.
I've just this week I had an email from one of the centres saying were any of the other centres experiencing trouble in recruiting, and I spoke to another 2 centres just yesterday, and they said they've gone out 3 times for one of them, for 3 times for their level 5 for childcare. And they can't get anybody to come into it because it's just, there's not the job security in it. So yeah.
Girijamba, have you got views on that around recruiting for, you know, quality staff, experienced staff when you're so dependent on funding?
Yes, it's 2 things: recruiting, and also our salaries are much lower than when you compare to other sectors or other agencies. And that's another thing, you know, you are expecting a social worker to come and do your work, then you have to pay that salary. So that's another reason you don't attract, you know, qualified and skilled staff. And those who are there, and after all the training and all, there is uncertainty with funding. There were times when we don't know until the last week of their termination of employment whether we'll get further funding or not. And another problem that we find is when you set up a new project, the project just picks up and the funding ends.
Yeah.
And it's such a waste of all the hard work that you put in. And we have those issues as well. And you lose skilled staff when they, and you can't blame them because people need money to survive, and you can't just keep them saying, oh yes, there is a possibility that we'll get funding. Yes, recruitment, salaries have been a major issue for us, and some of us, including me, we are on 2008 scale. No increment, nothing. We're paid at 2008 scale. At the same time, I find that other mainstream agencies are paying 2012, 2020 salaries. But we are trying to adjust the need to the funding, not the other way around. This is what the salary should be, and this is what the funding we need. It's okay, we are getting 100,000. How much work can we do for this 100,000? You know, and that's because of, we know how hard it is for BME. women, accessing our services. And if we are not there, then we feel we are disappointing the customers, not ourselves. We are disappointing the customers. That's the BME women in our case, fleeing domestic.
Absolutely. And
so most of us with that commitment is how we are okay to work with 2008 salaries. And not that we don't need more money, but it's that, and yeah.
But it relies on people being prepared to accept insecure work for low pay.
And it's not suitable for everybody. You might be the sole earner in the house, and then you cannot at the same time you want to work for this sector, but you're pushed out, and that's how you lose good staff. Yeah.
And we've had another question, which I'm going to pose to Viv and Baljit, which is about, this is from Catherine. And she says, Baljit spoke about there needs to be a shift in grant funding towards longer term commitments. And given that grant funding environment has plunged the sector into a constant state of competitiveness, what do panelists think could be done to influence the grants and foundation sector to initiate change? Do you want to answer that one, Baljit, first?
Can I just come in a little bit on the other question?
Yeah, of course.
As well. So what I wanted to do, because I do agree with what's been said by Karen and by Girijamba, but I also wanted to look at this issue in terms of structural inequalities, because it is linked to structural inequalities. So if we have a look at public procurement and how it operates and the impact that public procurement has had on the sector. So one of the things is price undercutting. So we know that in a competitive tendering exercise, the lowest price wins. Big housing associations that are non-violence against women and girls organizations can outbid the specialist women's organization, and that will bring all kinds of costs down. So it has a knock-on effect on all costs. And so when the lowest bid wins, it is not going to a women's organization, because we can't deliver economies of scale. And it means that surviving women's organizations, and this is what Girijamba was talking about in terms of the 2008 salaries, that surviving women's organizations must increase their casework without increasing the staffing to keep the costs down, and to defer any salary increases for remaining workers. And it also impacts future salaries for these workers. And one of the things that we have to remember is that 100% of or close to 100% of our sector, the specialist women's sector, employs women. So we are talking about widening the gender pay gaps and weakening employment rights for women when we have so much instability and insecurity. We will also have the introduction of 0 hours contracts, which actually weakens employment rights. So the message of underfunding also makes the sector less attractive as a sustainable resource for employment for women, for all of the reasons that have been highlighted. And again, we end up in this argument about the dismantling of the sector, which affects women's workforce, which affects access for women and girls to specialist support services. So it's all sort of connected to the way that inequalities operate in our society and the impact that procurement has in terms of widening those inequalities. In terms of the funders, yes, there needs to be a major shift. I think we can come out of competitive funding altogether. There is no need for competitive funding. So there should be a transformative shift in the dialogue about how violence against women and girls services are funded and resourced. And so I spoke a little bit about some of the opportunities that we have as a sector. We can do things differently. So we can look at different ways to resource this sector. And that means that we need to place this sector in the social justice framing of the work. We have to stop thinking about this work as commercially competitive. We have to stop thinking about, things like price undercutting in order to win a tender. We have to remove ourselves away from this regime altogether. And we need to recognize addressing violence against women as fundamental to protecting the human rights of women. And we have to think about this as social justice work. That means that we will then start to shift the dialogue on how this sector is resourced. And we shouldn't be competing for each other. Just one final thing, we have to recognize within this that specialist violence against women and girls organizations have a role to play, and we cannot be dismantled. So we have to also include in that dialogue that we have protecting violence against women and girls services.
Viv, do you want to come in?
Yes, I do, because everything's critical, because structural inequality pervades all institutions, so everything is connected, as Baljit said. I think there are significant things that independent trusts and foundations could do to actually lead the way in transforming how the women's sector's funding. The first thing they can do is name us in their criteria, please. The second thing they can do is apply full cost recovery that we've been talking about for decades, and still we're limited by a percentage. 10% if you're lucky, occasionally 15, even rarer 20. The other thing that we've been asking for decades is core or unrestricted funding. And I was fortunate enough to be part of what was called the equity partners to London funders around the emergency funding. We made some great inroads, more led by and for equalities organisations were funded, including women's organisations, including Black women's organisations. However, there was only a handful of how many funders who were interested in giving core or unrestricted grants. That is a massive problem. Would you expect anybody to run an organisation based upon only be able to do 1 or 3 year projections on your budget and finances? Nobody would suggest that was a good way to run anything, and yet we're supposed to be able to do that. Again, keeping women working in the sector in poverty, insecure employment, the absolute knowledge and expertise drained from the sector. So we're constantly retraining, spending more money that we don't have, and losing the historical knowledge that has been built up over decades with an iterative, dynamic, dialectical relationship with the women working in the orgs and the women using the services. That's how we developed. And we lose that when we have to say goodbye to women. Most women, we don't earn a lot of money in the sector already. We're on low wages comparatively. We do it because we're warrior women who want a revolution, but we still have to eat. We still have to pay our rent, and we still have to bring our children up or look after our parents or all the other care and responsibilities that fall upon us. So that would be my plea to funders. The biggest thing you can do is full cost recovery and core unrestricted funding. And can you tell me why you don't want to do core funding? Because the message we get is that you don't trust us.
I hear you, Viv. Girijamba, what would you like to say?
I just want to make a statement. There was a time when Violence Against Women Fund was ring-fenced. That's what I meant when we are going backwards. It was ring-fenced. And the minute they opened the gates, all other agencies who want domestic abuse criteria jumped onto the bandwagon, had something in their constitution or somewhere to say domestic abuse, and the funding was just diluted, and it kept diluting and diluting more and more. Or they increase this is an example, they increase 1 million into the budget and then 1 million organizations come and apply for the funding. How is that even going to help? So this is where I mean, going backwards. The violence against women is not going to go away in the next, I don't know how many years. We all know that there needs to be a funding. Why not go back to the old system and not tender, have a fixed or amount of funding for the agencies that have been supporting women fleeing domestic abuse historically, have 35, 40 years of experience. And these are the agencies who are losing out on tender. In Scotland, Lanarkshire Women's Aid's lost for a national organization which has nothing to do with domestic abuse. And that's the fear that we have. And we ourselves, our local authority, our funding is tendered, and last one, okay, we got, but there's no guarantee that we'll get the next one. And we have been here 35 years, and history is not taken into account when they're making assessments on the tender applications. So your history is irrelevant. All that you need to do, I can do this for £1, I can do this much work, whereas women said can't do that. And that's so. I don't believe when they say that they go for quality over the money. I think at the end of the day, when they say value for money, it's literally value for money.
Yeah,
that's what it is. And it's so frustrating, and sometimes you lose people, because there are times you don't sleep and you think, why am I even doing this? And it affects your family.
The personal
impact. I just want to rant because,
But it's not actually value for money. This is the other point. It is not value for money.
It's not value.
Money thrown down the drain because it's given to people here today, gone tomorrow, who do not have a human rights-based approach, who do not care about women's liberation or rights. And so what are you actually achieving in the long term? Also, we know, and I think somebody mentioned it earlier, I don't know if it was Karen, social return on investment. We've done studies that show women's orgs deliver 5 times the amount that they're given. And for some, it's even more than that. We are excellent value for money. It's got nothing to do with that. And the other thing I'd just like to add is that we're almost conned into believing, oh, there's not enough money. There's only this bit of money, that bit of money, what we're going to do, how we're going to share it out. Actually, no, we're one of the richest countries in the world. There's lots and lots of money. The problem is the political will to put it where it needs to go, not the lack of money.
I just want to say
Karen, I'm just ask Karen, do you want to come in on this?
I don't think I've a lot more to add. I do think, yes, I agree with everything Vivienne has said, and Girijamba, that the piecemeal funding that everybody lives on, the little bits, and trying to fit into funding programs instead of funding the need that's out there. It takes so much time and effort, and it's short term. I agree. In terms of funders, exactly what you said, Vivienne, there's a thing, we need the core funding and the costs around providing. So a lot of funders will fund a program, say it's a training program, but they're not funding who's setting that up, who's getting the bums on seats, who's organizing the women, who's doing the support behind the scenes, who's doing the finances of that fund. There's all those things that need to be taken into account that aren't. And it is, and I, unfortunately, because the competition is there because we're not funded enough, we're not supported, the sector is not valued. And I think we have to be valued more, and we have to be taken seriously. And as you say, the social return on investment in terms of what we provide, preventing women, supporting women in mental health and training and education, in childcare and socialization of children. You could go on and for the women's sector, but we have to be taken more seriously. Yeah.
I just want to say one thing. I think when I say value for money, and the government and the funders should stop looking at tick boxing. And if you look at immediate effect, value for money, you might not see the bigger picture. But the work that we do, if you look at the long term, impact on children, women, mental health, and stability in their lives, resilience, all this. If you look at all those things, in the long term, actually, we are saving so much more money for the government. And that's what I think funders, and yeah, there has to be more flexibility in how we work, and not, yeah, anyway, I can go on. Now I'm getting a bit emotional. You know, I want to say one thing, 100 things are coming in the mind that you just thinking. Yeah.
But then that's and people are saying in the chat, you know, it's great to see such passion, and it's so important if it's very, you know, even though it's very distressing. And I think that's what all of you have brought today, is this absolute clarity of the challenges that the women and girls sector faces, and it is so important that we name it in order to address it. Karen, did you want to come in quickly? And
it was just there, it was put in the chat, and I'm just in case you, I just think it was Helen put it in the chat there. If we in the women's sector went on strike, if we actually went on strike, you know, would we then be appreciated? Would they notice the work that we've done, never mind through COVID, but all the time? So maybe that's
what women will suffer, the service users will
that's
suffer.
It, yeah.
Today, I'm looking at the emails, the case they're saying, oh God, we have 4 women moving out, 3 women coming from somewhere. Everybody is panicking because we only have 7 staff who is doing that job. And yeah, this is the reality.
Well, I'm very conscious that we've got a couple of minutes left before the session is due to end. And I wondered if anybody had a final word that they wanted to say before I do wrap up the session. Girijamba, have you got a couple more words? I mean, a couple.
A couple. Like I said, I think work with women has to be acknowledged. And it's not, like I said, don't look at the immediate results, look at the long-term results. And we have to be funded sufficiently to do the job well. And it's not us looking after the service users, but I think the government and the funders have a role and responsibility to look after the staff that are providing the service. And I think we should go back to ring fencing funding for violence against women sector, so that we can plan long-term retained staff, and actually it'll save money and mental health.
Yeah. Baljit, do you want to have a final word?
Yeah, I think just something that I've been saying throughout is that this is about social justice work. This is not about competition. It's not about, you know, the corporate world or anything like that. So let's just make sure that we pull women's services from these horrible regimes that really end up dismantling and destroying this sector, and go back to the social justice framing of the work. In terms of the question about, you know, what can shift in grant funding, well, we know we know who is in this sector. So, you know, it is a question of funding those specialist women's organizations. It's as simple as that.
Karen, did you want to say some final words?
Just similarly to what has been, again, do appreciate us, listen to us. We know what the needs are out there. We know what needs supported. I really want to thank Rosa too, just the opportunity here, as we said, to collaborate and hear that, you know, we're not in the silos, and that sometimes where competition puts us, you know, even within our own areas. So, you know, you're afraid to mention a funding stream or something because somebody else is going for it or whatever, but that we can work across and have an opportunity like this to hear, you know, that you're not on your own, that these are the same things that are happening throughout the UK, and that we can come together and collaborate at other times, and hopefully have more opportunities to have discussions like this. Yeah,
that's brilliant. And Viv?
I think one of the things I'd like to see from the trusts and foundations is them engaging with those of us that are umbrella bodies, and paying us for our support and intelligence to improve their practices, because there's lots of things that could be done quite simply, and we're here ready to help them.
That's brilliant. Well, I thank you all for your contributions today. They really have been inspiring and brilliant. And you've left us all with so much to think about. And the particular issues around tackling the structural inequality that women and girls face, and particularly women and girls from Black and minoritized communities. And we need to go away with that ringing in our heads, and recognising the role that funders play in the grants and foundation sector, but in the government as well, as gatekeepers of that structural inequality, that we have such a critical role in terms of addressing that. And I wouldn't, I hope it goes without saying that Rosa, we know that we exist to resource, to champion, and to connect organisations like yours and organisations that have joined in today to participate and to hear. And we know that you need more money and more support and more space to be heard, so that you can meet the needs of women and girls, both as service providers, but also as advocates for those women and girls. And as Girijamba said, we can't go on strike because we know who the losers are in that situation. I've massively run over today, but it's been so interesting to hear what you've got to say. This is the final session of our conference. We have got a networking session at 4 o'clock, which I hope you can join up to. And I'm really pleased that over 700 people signed up to come to the conference over the last 2 days. It shows there's such an appetite for these events. I think that while the pandemic has been absolutely horrific in so many ways, it has also accelerated the process of us meeting online. And I hope that we can all meet in person as well in the coming months and years. But it does feel really positive that we've been able to come together in this way. And I'd like to thank you all for attending. I'd also like to thank Cummins, one of our key funders, who have enabled this conference to take place. And also to all the staff at Rosa. We were a team of 5 people, and the team really have worked together to pull this together. So thank you so much for being part of our conference, and we hope to see you again soon, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.